welcome to the podcast. I'm Karen Weaver. There's been a narrative for quite some time about campus buildings and amenities. You know, lazy rivers, climbing walls, fancy cafeterias, the whole nine yards. I could talk a lot about the amenities boom on the athletic side of campus. Athlete villages, gated communities built just for revenue-producing athletes. But today I wanted to focus on the other side of campus, the building of districts surrounding campus and the strategies to pay for them. My guest today was the co-author of a fascinating article in the Chronicle of Higher Education called The Heavy Cost of an Empty Campus. Karen Fisher, along with Lindsay Ellis, wrote, in 2014, investing in international student recruitment seemed like a good bet. The number of them coming to the United States was increasing at a never-before-seen pace, with enrollments passing 1 million students a year. Nearly 3 in 4 of those students chose doctoral granting institutions like the University of Kansas, a member of the Elite Association of American Universities, or the AAU. Kansas's goal was ambitious. It hoped to double its international student population, which then stood at about 2,200. The university hired an outside company to recruit students from around the globe and invested in programming to provide them with cultural immersion and to improve their English skills. Administrators also hoped that a sweeping campus renovation, including a state-of-the-art science building, modern student apartments, and a new student union, would boost the university's appeal. The two efforts, in fact, were mutually dependent. College officials were counting on international students to help fund the Central District, as the multi-million-dollar construction project was known. They would borrow to erect the buildings and use foreign student revenues to pay their creditors, unquote. Then the pandemic hit, and combined with the Trump administration's emphasis on limiting immigration, the number of international students attending top universities has now dropped precipitously. Student revenue frequently tied to the students being physically present on campus, is what keeps the lights on. My guest today is Karen Fisher. She is a senior writer for the Chronicle of Higher Education. She covers international education, the globalization of higher education, colleges, and the economy, and she is the Chronicle's chief international correspondent. Karen, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So the article that I referenced in the open has a subtitle, Decades of Disinvestment Left Public Research Universities Overexposed to COVID-19. Walk us through your reporting for this wonderful article.
Sure. I mean, the reporting on it actually started last summer, and it was spurred by a tweet, as sometimes good stories are, by a professor of education at the University of Wilmington, Kevin McClure. And he had this long Twitter thread about kind of tying COVID back to privatization. And it kind of got first my editor and then my partner on this project, Lindsay Ellis, and I thinking about how in some ways COVID-19 was kind of the same old story, really, that some of these real shifts that had been kind of bedeviling higher education, and particularly public higher education for years, was again what was happening during COVID, that it really in some ways tied back to these challenges that colleges have felt as they've come to rely more and more on student tuition and how that is driving these choices. And so one of the things we really wanted to do was look at how were colleges constrained even at the beginning of the pandemic, and how did they sort of have to make kind of their choices in this box, because all these other decisions that they had made in previous years made it impossible for them to make some other choices.
Interesting. So let's go back and look at the decisions that many governors made back in 2012 as part of the pushback, if you will, towards spending. And the governor of Kansas, Sam Brownback, like many other governors, decided to cut back dramatically on higher education funding. Talk a little bit about that, where that left Kansas and other states.
I mean, Kansas is certainly an extreme example. Brownback was, or is, I don't think he's changed his mind, an adherent of Arthur Laffer, really believed in the notion of supply side economics. That is, if you cut spending and gave taxpayers back the money, that would incentivize businesses to spend more, and thus, even if you'd cut spending, you'd actually bring in more revenue into the tax coffers. And so he made these huge cuts, but in some ways, and certainly other governors made cuts, although Kansas, again, kind of just is kind of like the exemplar for this. And it was so bad that Republican controlled state legislature actually went and undid some of the cuts later on down the road, but they did not until they'd already had quite an impact. But in some ways, the tax example is kind of emblematic of what sort of the challenges that colleges face in states, which is to say that there are always these other choices that governors, that legislators, that the taxpayers themselves, the public, are weighing. Do you want to cut taxes because either, like Brownback, you believe it's going to incentivize spending, or maybe you're just a person who believes fundamentally that people, the public, should keep more of their paycheck, and so you're anti-tax. And so that's a choice you're making. And if you do that, then you can't spend money on colleges. If you spend money on K through 12, which is mandated in most states, that's money that you can't spend on higher education, prisons, Medicaid, building roads and infrastructure. All these things are the things that are frequently getting weighed. And when push comes to shove, historically, what's happened is that higher education is one of the few of these parts of state government that has this other sort of revenue stream, which is student tuition. And so you've seen again and again and again, colleges make this, or rather states make this choice to not spend as much money on higher education because they've put that money someplace else. And then this all became just a massive problem during this last year of the pandemic.
And they were coming out of the Great Recession, and we don't want to pick on Kansas, but your article lists a number of schools like Miami University of Ohio that is, around 70% dependent on tuition. And these were Carnegie classified schools, I think that your article looked at. So these are high research focused institutions. We typically talk about tuition dependent when we're talking about private schools. And yet your article really looked at this change in the public school dynamic that we traditionally think of as being state related or state supported. And yet in this situation, higher education got the short end of the stick.
Yeah, we do typically think of private colleges or regional publics as being tuition dependent. But the fact is that in more than half the states now, students pay and their families pay more than half the bill. And in a few states, they pay more than 70% of the bill. And so they're just become a really major revenue source. And you mentioned the Great Recession. We've just not really ever come back from that. I mean, this dynamic of shifting towards a reliance on student tuition began back in the 80s, frankly, but it just got hypercharged with recession, and we've never really recovered. And I mean, to arrive at the institutions we did put our focus on, I mean, we actually pulled data. And so we were looking at things like tuition dependence, growth in out-of-state students, all these sort of these components of privatization. And that's kind of what led some of our reporting and the focus of our work.
So one of the things that you talked about was this, it's an overused term, but I'm going to use it, arms race, that university campuses feel like they need to have in order to attract and retain students. And Kansas started building some extra kinds of things. Walk us through what they were building.
Sure. I mean, Kansas, in some ways, was faced with some real infrastructure challenges. They were not getting money for capital improvements from the state. They had a real backlog. But they also wanted to build some more state-of-the-art things. So not just buildings, but much nicer apartment style housing, for example, a nicer student center, things like that. And so when they were confronted with this, they said, how can we do this? We're not going to get money from the state. So they had to borrow. And I think that's increasingly what we've seen is um, colleges look for more sort of creative financing options to do this. And as you say, I mean, a lot of the reason that colleges point to for entering into these kinds of financial arrangements is if they don't do that, they will be lost. They will lose out. You know, that students are choosing between other institutions when they go to college, and particularly students, out of state students, or in Kansas's case, international students are choosing, and they're looking at the amenities that other institutions have. And so, you know, sometimes, I mean, we talk about climbing walls and lazy rivers, but often it's just more comfortable on-campus housing that these colleges are after. But they feel like if they don't do this, if they don't spend, then they won't attract these students who can pay. And so it becomes this kind of never-ending cycle.
So you're dependent already on students who pay the tuition up to 70, 74, 75%, but you need them to come. And so if they don't come, then either you up your amenities or you get into a discounting kind of war, a war where you're trying to give more merit aid. The COVID-19 hit Kansas and the students didn't come. Let's talk about what that meant when all of a sudden you can't fill those beds that you set up with a public-private partnership, or people aren't dining in the restaurants that they've built alongside the campus because the students were sent home. What does that mean?
I mean, so campuses got a little bit of a taste of this last spring when, you know, they had to close down abruptly, and a lot of campuses were under pressure at that point to give some sort of rebate back, and they were losing money because a lot of the times, because often these ways of financing public-private partnerships is what they called, or P3s, are often not done for academic buildings. They're often done for other buildings on campus, residence halls, parking garages, things that you know states are not as willing to spend money on. And so these things are then often tied to the revenues generated by the buildings themselves. So if you don't have people, whether it's students, whether it's alumni for football games, coming and parking in your parking garage, you have no parking fees, well, then you don't have the revenue stream to pay for the parking garage and to pay off that debt. If your students don't show up and sleep in the residence halls, then you don't have that funding stream. If they're not coming in and using their meal plans and eating the dining halls, how are you going to pay for those facilities? How are you going to pay those workers? And so it became this sort of cycle. And I mean, you see some of the credit rating agencies cautioning that colleges could be in a real jam if they can't get this revenue, because they have taken on increasing amounts of debt recently. But the irony being, right now during the pandemic, in fact, there's likely to be more borrowing because the cost of borrowing remains low, and where else are colleges going to turn? And so we're still in the middle of this cycle.
I find that kind of interesting because, yes, it doesn't cost much to borrow right now, but still Moody's and others are downgrading their outlook from stable to negative, or, you know, lowering the bond rating, if you will. And so that makes me think about when a school's in a situation like most schools were with COVID, where you had some students on campus, or it was fits and starts, who was on campus, who was off. Are schools then responsible for helping these public-private partnerships pay the debt? Does it come back to them, or does it come to the private part of the partnership to pay it, or do they both do it?
I mean, there's different ways that they're structured, but the private partner is often, which is often actually just a nonprofit arm of the institution itself. They're borrowing the money, but there's the agreement is that the college is going to pay off that debt. And so whether it's, you know, whether it's technically speaking that the private partner is paying the debt and the college is paying the partner through, say, sometimes they will guarantee, for example, a certain occupancy rate in the dormitories so that the private partner then knows it's going to get, X number of dollars in housing fees. They're on the, I think the bottom line is colleges are on the hook for this money, and they've got to find out how to pay for it. And I think one of the challenges that they face is that oftentimes explicitly they're not supposed to be using taxpayer funding for this. And so they've got to, and do they want to take tuition? I mean, maybe they're still getting tuition, for example, if students aren't on campus but are taking online courses. But do you want to put your student tuition dollars towards debt service?
Yeah.
Not so much.
Yeah, it's a great question. I certainly saw it here in Philadelphia with empty residence halls, empty off-campus apartments, and I was like, well, it's costing them money just to keep them warm, in the winter, to keep the power on, so you've got it when you need it. I mean, and there's no revenues coming in, so it's not at all surprising that schools would lose 15% of their revenues off the top just because the students haven't been on campus, right?
Yeah, and you saw that, I mean, a lot of the colleges we looked at, when college leaders were communicating with faculty about planning for the fall, they were saying quite bluntly sometimes, look, if we don't get we need to get the students back because it's essential for our financial viability. One of the people, I mean, Lindsay and I also talked with dozens of higher education experts to kind of form the basis so we could even start kind of asking good questions and looking at the right kind of aspects of this. And one person said to me that if you looked at a lot of the processes that institutions went through in deciding whether to reopen, that he characterized it as sometimes the choice wasn't really whether to reopen, but how to get there, how to get to reopening. Like it was always like, how can we get students back? And that was kind of the end goal because of necessity.
Yeah, and you quoted Kevin McClure, an associate professor at UNC Wilmington, whose tweet you originally got you thinking about us.
Yeah,
said, what you see with COVID is what happens when you build a model, an academic model, around the presence of students as consumers. And this struck me as one of the really key parts of your piece, is that we need, in order to make this model work, we have to treat the students as consuming goods on our campuses so that we get some of the revenues. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, I think, this has been the shift of, hired as a public good to a private one, focused on the individual consumer. And so what do you do to make that consumer happy, to make them satisfied, to make them want to consume or purchase the product that you're selling, which is in this case, education. But it's also that whole student experience. And when you look at a lot of reopening statements, one thing you'll see is a lot of college presidents saying, we're going back because this is what our students want, that they don't feel like they're going to get the quote unquote college experience sitting at their laptop in their parents' basement, that they want to come back and not just get the classroom experience, but the whole experience, which, is these amenities that we've been talking about. It's often college athletics, and it's the co-curricular. And so how can we, to give these consumers what they want, and you can debate sometimes about how presidents arrived at this. I mean, certainly given the choice, I don't think students, generally speaking, said that they wanted to be, taking online classes. But, were they actually demanding it, or was this sort of sense that we've built up over years about the consumer experience at the center of what college is? Is that the thing that then led college presidents to just innately sort of be driven um, by trying to reach this end goal for the students?
It's a great point, and I think that post COVID-19, we're looking at campuses where we still don't know what our enrollment's going to look like for fall of 2021. Of course, community colleges have been devastated by the pandemic in terms of enrollment. Other enrollments have been, fluctuating in anywhere from 3 to maybe 10% loss on campuses. But the value proposition is what I hear parents talking about. And they don't want to pay full freight for Zoom classes. But also, if they come back to campus, then it puts tremendous pressure on the campus to deliver everything all at once. It's not really phasing in. Like athletics plays a really key role in setting the tone that we're back. We're all back here. You can come back and have fun. Did you see a role for athletics in any of your piece about what kind of tone it set in trying to get students to come back?
I mean, I think whether it was about getting students to come back specifically, I think there was a lot of pressure to bring athletics back. And certainly you saw that. I mean, there are a number of, football conferences, for example, that never canceled, and two that did. The Big Ten and the Pac-12 ended up reversing their choices and playing. Their seasons were short, and they canceled a lot of games because of outbreaks on teams. I mean, the New York Times has done some great work looking at how college sports were real hotbeds of COVID outbreaks on campuses.
Yeah.
But I think that they were driven to do that for a couple of reasons. One is this student consumer experience. I mean, at the University of Oregon, which was another institution we looked at, I mean, they know that whether or not it's the deciding factor for students, quite often the familiarity, particularly for students who might be out of state, they become familiar with these colleges because they see them, playing football on TV on the weekends, and so it's kind of, the front door into the institution. And it's something that not just students, but alumni as well, it builds support for the institution. So it attracts students to pay tuition, it attracts alumni who give dollars and donations. So there's this whole ecosystem. And then the other thing is that college sports is or certain college sports, football, basketball, the money-making sports, they make big money. I mean, the Big Ten pulled in, $780 million from television revenues and apparel and other kinds of merchandising. And so, I think that the sports question was both related to the students as consumers, but also related to these questions of privatization in so much as it's another revenue stream, and maybe it's not subsidizing other things at the universities, but it's allowing sports to happen in general. I mean, we know that football subsidizes and basketball subsidize most of the other sports on college campuses. And so I think the incentives pointed in the direction to want to play sports this past fall and spring.
And also just creating normalcy, right? Everything's fine here, nothing to look at because we're still playing football.
Well, I mean, the president of Ohio State said that, she said every time she got on, she was doing a lot of Zoom meetings with students. And one of the things that she said every single call, they said to her, thank you for playing sports, because, at least on that Saturday afternoon, that's the one thing that feels like normal to us.
Yeah. Boy, that's a whole fascinating line. I could go down for hours, but I want to stay on this topic of these public-private partnerships and also alternative revenue ideas. One of the things that you mentioned was what the University of South Carolina did, which was they just said, you know what, from 2012 until 2020 or 2021, we're just going to add more students. We're just going to try to grow our campus size. What did your research show? Has that been successful, or did that suffer from the same problems that other schools did with no students on campus?
It's very much the same problem, particularly because almost always, with the exception of a few high growth states, the institutions that follow this strategy, and certainly not all do. I mean, there certainly are institutions that say, look, we're going to bank on our prestige, and we're going to be very exclusive, and that's going to be to our benefit. But institutions like South Carolina said, look, we're not getting the revenue from the state. If we want to actually get better and become a better institution, then we've got to attract more students to pay for the labs and the research funding, and more professors and better professors, and so their bet was to attract more students, and they wanted to attract a specific student, that is students from out of state, so either out of state or international students. And to do those things, that then you get back into these same questions that we've just been talking about, because now you've got to convince a student who's a consumer to come from another place and pay more money to do it. And so what are you offering then? You're going to have to say, there's something about this experience that's better. We've got the best football team, or we have this great tradition on at basketball games, and we build such school spirit. We've got the nicest, amenities and dormitories. Our professors are the best. So you again get into this sort of catering to the student as consumer, and how do you do that? Because I guess the one thing I would just say is that the challenge is, and the reason they've got to grow bigger, is because the one thing you can't do, especially if you're a public institution, and say, oh, we're going to take in a lot of students from California or China at the expense of our individual students, even if they're not going to pay. They're not giving you as much money and support and state support. Legislatures are not going to stand for you pushing out your local students to take in of these other students, and so therefore you've got to grow.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that. I had an earlier podcast last year with a research group that looked at the University of Alabama and how they had upended their recruiting strategy for students with that very strategy you just talked about: out of state, high achieving students, giving them a lot of merit aid to come down to Tuscaloosa, but the key is they were pushing out in-state students to try to attract the difference financially with the out-of-state students. But one of the draws was, come see Alabama play football, come be part of the stadium and the stadium experience. So I wonder if other schools aren't trying to replicate that same model with saying, let's just recruit more kids from out of our states. But you're right, it's a balance with the state legislatures. It really is.
I mean, a lot of them are. I mean, Oregon was. I mean, that one was not the only goal, but it was certainly one of them. I mean, Kansas was banking on not out of state students, but international students to help, fund some of its building boom.
And we lost a lot of international students in the last 4 years because it just was harder to get into the U.S. to come study.
Yeah, I mean, it's been the numbers had been booming, but they have been softening, and now, I mean, the pandemic, no group has declined as precipitously as international students, because they simply can't get here. And I think I don't have a crystal ball, but I think one of the real sort of nail biters is what's going to happen next year, and are those students going to be able to get here, and if they can, are they going to still want to come?
Yeah, absolutely. Since we're talking about Kansas, I had to bring up what just happened at the University of Kansas, and conversely, what is also going on at Kansas State. Kansas State just had their athletics department bond rating downgraded from stable to negative, because they're trying to keep up in the arms race with everybody else. They're trying to build new facilities. So in the middle of trying to go from the doormat up to maybe the middle of the pack, they're also finding their other options for getting money are going to be harder to get and maybe cost more because their borrowing rating isn't so good. Also, in the last couple of days, Kansas has decided to let their football coach go and pay him well over $1 million to go away. And then they just let their athletic director go. So these kinds of typical, I put that in air quotes, typical expenses that we take, we take for granted every year in athletics that come out are coming on top of all of this other stuff, all these other pressures that are happening on Kansas's campus. Karen, you've been studying this for a long time. You're an excellent writer and understander from an objective point of view about where these kinds of schools go at this point. But what do you think? Where do you think we're headed in 2022 and beyond? And what if the students don't come back?
I mean, I think it's going to be really, really difficult, not just year, but it's going to be a difficult next couple of years. I mean, you look at Kansas, and since the time that Lindsay and I wrote our story, the state has told the University of Kansas is going to cut its budget by $75 million. They're talking about eliminating departments. The Board of Regents there has given them the authority to fire tenured professors. They're in really, really bad shape. And there just doesn't seem like what's the escape valve here. State budgets are hurting. I mean, I think one of the things we'll be looking at, and I know in fact some of my colleagues already are looking at, is, does some of this most recent round of COVID relief, does that help reduce some of the tensions? And I'm not even talking about the money that goes directly to colleges so much as, what is the money that goes to states due to the really shaky situation of many, many state budgets. But I think, unfortunately, there's nothing that's going to break this cycle. And if anything, the dependency has increased because there isn't any other sort of outlet. And so, colleges are going to need to try to get students back on campus and to try to get their tuition dollars. And it's only March. Just think about it. This time last year, the colleges were just closing campuses, but already there have been a lot of institutions announcing that they're going to be reopening and in person in the fall. And I think that there's a lot of pressure on college presidents to, especially now that we've got a vaccine, to be optimistic and to send that message early to students. So now when they're making, especially the incoming students, when they're making their choices this spring, they're getting this message that you can have that college experience you want. Come to my institution, because that's what you're going to get.
And then you've got all the competing demands of how much student debt can I take on? Do I really want to separate myself out for 4 years from the workforce? Maybe I want to go to school part-time and take some classes over the internet and some classes in person. I see this whole next generation evolving into wanting multiple choices, not just the choice of come to campus or they don't, but they're going to want multiple choices, which costs schools money to create those opportunities.
Yeah, that's been an interesting sort of outbreak of this. Outgrowth of this is it has, in fact, particularly in the delivery of courses, it is, we've seen this just under pressure, a lot of innovation. And so the question is going to be, do we go back to normal, or is it going to be this new normal where it's not just either or, but it's yes and yes, do what you used to do, but also take some of this stuff that you've developed in this last pandemic year and apply that too. And I think one of the things that a number of studies have suggested is that while students may actually, depending on the kinds of courses and depending on the students themselves, they may be more open to taking some of their courses online. At least when we're talking about traditional aged college students, a lot of them still do want that campus experience. They are maybe buying, what colleges are selling when they're talking about, the experience that happens, the full college experience that happens outside the classroom. And so I think there's also pressure from the consumer to have that back for the fall.
Yeah, we got to be able to throw the frisbee on the quad. That's really important. Well, Karen, thank you so much for your time today and helping us understand this unique opportunity, this moment where students and consumers and how institutions react to trying to keep consumers spending in their ecosystems. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, it was fun, Karen.